Hello, I'm George Smith, and this is the second talk in a series of at least 5 talks on the history of libertarian ideas. The theme that I want to explore today briefly is an extraordinarily important one. It has traditionally been known as liberty of conscience or freedom of conscience. Those terms mean the same thing. Now, when we think of freedom of conscience or liberty of conscience, we probably think of freedom of religion. And we may know something about the various conflicts that arose, especially in post-Reformation Europe, over freedom of religion. But this is a theme that really encompasses much more than just freedom of religion, because when you think of the term conscience, what does it really imply? It implies, at least in my mind and in the minds of many past libertarians, the right to make judgments and the right to act on those judgments in areas far beyond just religious beliefs. For example, in the 19th century, Herbert Spencer and other so-called nonconformists or dissenters in England argued that the right of conscience extended to things like charity against compulsory welfare. They argued that the individual, using his or her right of conscience, should be able to decide to whom he or she wishes to give charity. It should not be extracted by force from the state. And if it is, it's no longer charity, it's just extortion. This idea was also extended to the area of education. Freedom of education, explicitly argued by many nonconformists against the sort of the coming tide of state education movement in England. But the nonconformists argued that freedom of conscience means that you have the right to decide how your children shall be educated. Now let's go back and inquire why freedom of conscience was even a point of contention. In a way, it seems like a fairly obvious point. I mean, Americans especially are pretty much used to freedom of religion. We think it's pretty obvious. So we think, well, gee, it's no big deal. You believe what you want to believe. You go to the church you want to go to, or no church at all. You can be an atheist, an agnostic, some kind of Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, whatever you want to be. And as long as you don't forcibly interfere with the worship of other people, what you do is your own business. It's a matter of your individual conscience. It seems so obvious, we just wonder, what's the big deal? Why did it take so long? What were the arguments against it? And I would note that the hard-fought battle for freedom of conscience was argued on explicitly libertarian grounds, so we might view its victory, maybe going back to the 18th century, as perhaps the first, and I would say the most important, libertarian victory ever. If you think libertarians have never had victories historically, this is one notable exception. Now let's go back and take this a little bit in terms of just some general reasoning about why it's such an issue. Well, first of all, let me give you a hypothetical. Suppose that you live in a fictional society called Ruritania, and there's a god that rules over Ruritania, and his name is Blictory. By the way, the word Blictory was a traditional 18th century nonsense word. When freethinkers wanted to say, we don't know what God is, let's just call it such and such, they use the word Blictory. So I'll use that word. So we have this god named Blictory who rules over Ruritania. And this god tells the ruler of Ruritania that every member of Ruritania must light a candle in my honor sharply at 9 o'clock every night without fail. And if some members fail, the whole society will be punished. Blictory will punish not just the people who fail to light candles. He will punish everybody. He will bring plagues. He will bring devastation, earthquakes, whatever, if it gets bad enough. Now at this point, you're the ruler, and you're thinking, well, should I respect the right of conscience of those dissenters who don't believe in Blictory or don't want to worship the god Blictory? Well, what do you do in that case? If everyone is going to be punished for the non-belief or the sins of a few, well, that certainly, at the very least, makes it more complicated, the issue of freedom of religion more complicated, because in such a case, if I disbelieve, everyone's going to get punished, not just me. Now, I'm mentioning this as sort of a side note to point out that this was one thing that made the rise of science so important in the rise of classical liberalism and libertarianism, because it was commonly believed, and not just with the Christians, but going back to the Romans, that a god or gods would punish a wide group of people for the sins or disbelief of a few. In fact, it was an old saying among Rome that there's been an earthquake, and that the Christians caused it. In other words, the gods were displeased by these Christian fanatics running around, and they punished all Romans. It was an old saying in Rome, an old proverb, that, in effect, the Christians are responsible. Christianity inherited that way of looking at the world, and held that natural disasters were often punishments for an entire society. So this is just one thing to keep in mind. I'm not saying a libertarian case couldn't be made for freedom of religion in that society, but it wouldn't be as easy to make. And this is why you find during the Enlightenment so much stress on science as against what was commonly called superstition. So much stress on the natural causes of natural disasters rather than being some kind of supernatural punishment. Because as long as it was believed that an earthquake or a flood or whatever, a famine or a plague, was divine punishment of an entire society, it was very difficult to get the argument in that people should be free to believe whatever they like, for the reasons I mentioned previously. Now let's go back to the early Christian era and look at what is particular to Christianity. Now, if you look at Roman polytheism, and Edward Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, has some very good discussions of this. If you look at polytheism, and it varies. I mean, the Romans did have this notion that the emperor was divine. This is in later Roman history, and that you had to offer a token. There was, putting some kind of token gesture, token sacrifice to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. The Christians, of course, refused to do this, to their great credit, I must say, and they were punished for it. But other than that, in a polytheistic society, probably you're not going to have a lot of religious persecution as long as you believe in one of the accepted gods. Atheists were still looked upon with great suspicion, but if you said that my favorite God is X rather than Y, people didn't care that much. Well, along comes Christianity. Now, what does Christianity say? Well, Christians were, first of all, an exclusive religion in that sense that you could not be saved unless you believed in a certain number of tenets, essential tenets. They were also a salvationist religion. It was also a salvationist religion in that you had to believe certain things in order to be saved. So what it came down to was this. There emerged in Christianity the notion of orthodoxy, that is, right thinking. Because if you were a wrong thinker, if you were unorthodox, or a heretic or a non-believer, you would not be saved. You would not go to heaven in the common vernacular. Therefore, you have this emphasis on belief as opposed to action. You had to have the right belief. Now along comes Augustine, St. Augustine, in the late 4th, early 5th centuries. And in this case, we're talking about arguments that developed in the early 5th centuries, early 400s. Augustine became the first systematic theorist of religious persecution. In fact, he used the term righteous persecution to label his particular approach. Now, I'm going to have to leave out a lot of details here. The context that this is in Africa, North Africa. There's these Donatists, these heretics. Some of them are violent, some are not. Augustine was originally a proponent of religious toleration. He later changed his mind. But now, let's consider the argument he used. It was based on the exclusive salvationist ideas of Christianity. Basically, by righteous persecution. And by the way, I'm stretching this argument because it literally took centuries to come up with a good rebuttal to this argument. Righteous persecution meant that you could use coercion for a righteous cause. In this case, if coercion would result in saving somebody's soul so that they would enjoy eternal salvation, then Augustine said, wouldn't that be worth it? If you have a friend or a child or a wife or a husband, and they're going to go to hell because they believe incorrectly, they have unorthodox beliefs, then if you could exert coercion against them and bring them to the right belief, then wouldn't they thank you? Wouldn't they say, oh, we're so glad, because now they're going to spend an eternity in paradise rather than eternity in hell. This was called a righteous persecution, and he knew it was persecution because he said it was for a righteous cause. He even used the example of of a house that you know is about to fall down. The inhabitants of the house won't leave. So would you be justified in rushing in and forcing them to come out against their wills, perhaps because they don't believe you, for example? Then he says, well, of course you would. And that would be righteous because you're saving their lives even if it's against their wills. Then he posits the idea that somebody on an upper story jumps to his death, commits suicide, rather than let you save them. And he said, would it still be worth it to save everybody else if one person committed suicide? So yes, even then it would be justified. Now before I go on, because whenever I mention this argument to freethinkers, my fellow freethinkers, they often say things like, well, that's just for those crazy people who believe in an afterlife and who believe in hell. It wouldn't apply to anyone else. Yet think about it. That idea of righteous persecution, without the religious part, is still very common in American society today. The notion of persecuting, that is forcing people for their own good, we find in drug laws, we find in all kinds of laws but drug laws in particular. In fact, I once wrote an article, it's in my second book, Atheism, Ayn Rand, and Other Heresies, called The Righteous Persecution of Drug Consumers. And if you look at the arguments that are used against drug consumers today, they parallel exactly all of the arguments that Augustine used. One example, I won't go through all the examples, one example is he talks about how these persecuted people, once they were converted, thanked their persecutors and said, "I'm so glad you used force against me, because now I see the light, now I'm saved." How many times have you seen some show or other where some guy that was put in jail for because he was a drug addict later thanks his persecutors, says, "Oh, I'm so glad I went to jail because I was able to kick my habit." Augustine even talks about wrong beliefs, evil beliefs being the result of bad habits that have to be broken. Now, I want to mention one side note here to show how strong this argument was. An earlier argument, and one that became very common later as well, that Augustine himself used, was that you cannot force beliefs, that coercion is pointless, it's useless, because what a person does and does not believe will depend on the evidence. So if I told you, for example, if you're an atheist and I point a gun at your head and said, "I want you to believe in God or I'm going to kill you," how would you do that unless the person presented evidence that you found convincing? To take a more extreme case of a logical truth, if I said, "You must believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5, and I will torture you until you believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5, could you convince yourself to believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5? In that case, it would be absolutely impossible. Well, this was actually a big point of contention for centuries among Christian theologians. Can you coerce people? Can you torture them, threaten them, whatever, and change their minds about their religious beliefs? Augustine came up with a very clever guy, probably a genius, if an evil one in this respect, came up with an interesting series of arguments, and he said, true, you can't literally use force to get someone change their mind, but you can soften them up, so to speak. He then went on to discuss the reasons as to why people don't hold the correct beliefs in any area. And he said in some cases they're just lazy, in other cases it's inertia, they grew up with the wrong beliefs, and basically, to put it very crudely, if you rattle their cage a bit with force, they'll kind of snap out of it and they'll be more receptive to hear the truth. So, as I said, Augustine thought you could soften people up. Some people he thought were incorrigible, they're lost, but if you can save even some people through this process of rattling the cage and saying, hey, here's the truth, and read the Bible, or read what you're supposed to believe, some people will, in fact, come over to the correct beliefs and be saved. Now, I've taken a while to explain this idea of righteous persecution, because if I were to pinpoint one of the most tenacious, and I would add destructive beliefs, anti-libertarian beliefs in all of the history of Western society, I would say this is very close to being it. The idea that you can force people for their own good is an extraordinarily important belief, and it held sway all through the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. He used it, he invoked the same argument, and it continues to hold sway until the doctrine of individual rights starts to take hold roughly, I would say, in the 17th century. And now here we get in then to the arguments for liberty of conscience, and they were specifically used to refute Augustine's arguments for righteous persecution. We now come to the actual arguments for freedom of conscience, and I should note here, there's another factor to this whole historical argument that I really haven't mentioned, and that's the status that biblical arguments played. We're dealing, of course, with an intensely Christian context, a Christian community, and the Bible really had the last say in these types of arguments. In other words, if your philosophical arguments didn't harmonize with the Bible, what especially the New Testament taught, then they didn't count for anything. Now here, in the area of religious freedom or toleration, there were two pillar passages that were commonly cited. I'm not going to go into these except to mention them. One was called the parable of the feast, which occurs in Luke 14:15-25. The other was called the parable of the tares, which occurs in Matthew 13:24-30. The first parable, the parable of the feast, was the one that was cited over and over and over again from the time of even before Augustine all the way up through the 18th century in favor of Augustine's righteous persecution. The other, the parable of the tares, was the most commonly cited passage by the opponents of religious persecution, including members of the Catholic Church. It would take me quite a while to explain these passages and how they were used, so I won't. I will simply illustrate the importance of these by pointing out that with the parable of the feast, which ends with those words, compel them to come in that my house may be full, this was the part of that parable that was cited again and again by proponents, by advocates of religious persecution, compel people to become Christians, compel them to come into the church. So important was this, even going into the late 17th century, that a fellow named Pierre Bayle, B-A-Y-L-E, who is an ambiguous figure in the history of philosophy because at times he appears to be an Orthodox Calvinist, or in fact, a lot of scholars believe, and I'm among them, he was really a freethinker who was kind of disguising his true beliefs. He wrote a very thick book in the English translation, and a very nice edition published by Liberty Fund. In the English translation, running over 600 pages, the title of this book, I know you can't see the title, so I'll just read it to you. A philosophical commentary on these words of the gospel, Luke 14:23, compel them to come in that my house may be full. Now again, you're dealing with a book, a very thick book, that deals with nothing but arguments based on that one biblical passage. And this is fairly late. I don't remember the exact date this was published, but it was probably 1680, somewhere around there. That illustrates the great importance of these biblical passages, that late in history even, that Bayle had to write a 600-page plus book just on that one passage. But what this comes down to is that the argument for religious freedom couldn't really take root until the biblical arguments became less significant, until the Bible pretty much became irrelevant so far as political arguments were concerned. Of course, individual Christians still believed in the Bible, that was fine, but what became pretty much unacceptable was to drag in the Bible and to prove your case by citing biblical passages. When philosophers were arguing, and this is a key characteristic of the Enlightenment, even going back to the 1670s, 1680s, look at John Locke. John Locke doesn't quote biblical passages, although he believed in the Bible to a certain extent. He doesn't try to make his case by saying, this is what Jesus said, or whatever. He gives philosophical arguments. There were still exceptions in Locke's time, but when you get into the 18th century Enlightenment, one of the essential characteristics of the Enlightenment is the Bible no longer plays a role, or a very minor role, in philosophical controversies about freedom of religion, that sort of thing. If you couldn't base your case on reason and reason alone, then you couldn't really, you weren't taken seriously. That was a very important development. Now, about freedom of conscience, or liberty of conscience itself. A book I want to recommend, I know again you can't see the title, it's a little paperback by Paul Strom. It's called Conscience, A Very Short Introduction. This goes into the actual history of the term conscience, or conscientia, a Roman term that was later adopted by Christians. He goes into when Christians picked it up in a certain translation of the Bible by St. Jerome. One interesting thing that Strom goes into is the interesting ambiguity in conscientia, the Latin term, because con here would mean mutual, or more than one person. And scientia being knowledge, it would imply a type of knowledge that's common to not just, and it's not unique to you, but has something in common with other people. And he points out, not particularly important to our purpose here, that an appeal to conscience in the Middle Ages, throughout the Middle Age period, or the medieval period, excuse me, meant appealing to the authority of the church in many cases. It didn't mean to one's interior private judgment. But with the Protestant Reformation, with the authority of the church undermined, you no longer have an intermediary between you and God. Conscience, the idea of conscience becomes interiorized. It's an inner voice. They sometimes talked about it, the voice of God being within. The problem for secular philosophers was to explain what this conscience was. And there's a whole history. He outlines it here. There's a lot more that he doesn't go into, that Strom doesn't go into. But it explains, if you read someone like, and I know this may be a little esoteric to some of my viewers, but if you're familiar with Adam Smith's great book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was his first book. It's better, I think, a greater book in some ways, I think, than his Wealth of Nations, which is better known. Smith was a professor of moral philosophy. He wasn't known as an economist at the time. He was known as a moral philosopher. But in a nutshell, what Smith attempts to do in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, the term moral sentiments would be what we mean by conscience today, those moral feelings that we have inside of ourselves that impel us to do something or to refrain from doing something. Smith had some nice terms for that. He called it the impartial spectator. That was one of his terms for conscience, a very significant term. He also called it that little man within. which I think we can all relate to. When you're doing something that you know you shouldn't be doing, you hear almost this voice within, that little man within, saying no. It's almost like the old movies of the devil and the angel, one telling you to do it, the other telling you not to do it. But what is this conscience? Well, it's, as I said, it's not really germane to our purpose here to go into exactly what it is. But what Smith attempted to do was to show that basically conscience arises, our sense of conscience arises from our interaction with other people. It's a social product in the sense that Smith thought that as we grow up in a society, we see how other people react to our behavior. We then take those reactions and we sort of internalize them and start judging ourselves by those sort of common standards. And so you have that idea of the impartial spectator. In other words, the idea of conscience is not just to have a whim or I feel like doing this. It's to have an objective reason for doing something. That's why Smith called it the impartial spectator. And here we come to an important distinction that I raised in my first talk, the difference between an act being moral and an act being just. There can be acts which are just, that is, violate nobody's rights, but which are immoral. And here's how that distinction plays a role here. If I were to say to you, to use the term that Ayn Rand used all the time, whim. I have a whim. I just feel like doing something. Now, it may turn out that my whim is immoral. It's something I should not have done, but it was nevertheless just in the sense that I maybe destroyed a valuable painting that I owned. I had the right to destroy it, but some people might consider that sort of a crime against art or something. I mean, there's a number of examples you can think of like this. So conscience wasn't a matter of whim. Conscience was a reasoned judgment that had an objective basis, or at least that you had evidence to think that it had an objective basis. So if you said, I consider conscientious objectors to war, when we look at a conscientious objector, even if we disagree with them, we tend to say not only are they acting justly, they're also acting morally. They're not just acting on whim. To act from conscience is not just to say, I feel like doing such and such. So what had to happen for the idea of the rights of conscience to come about? Well, to my knowledge, the term liberty of conscience itself, we first find that early Reformation period in the early 1500s. Martin Luther, the great reformer, German reformer, may have been first to use the liberty of conscience, the actual expression. I don't know for sure. Some historians think maybe he was. But if you read what Luther says, he talks about liberty of conscience for Christians. And basically he meant that Christians had to make up their own minds exactly what God demanded of them. Now you might think that the Reformation led to a great call for liberty of conscience, and this sort of was the old 19th century apologetics for Protestantism. It was to Protestantism that we owed the rise of liberty of conscience. That's true in a sense, but it's untrue in another sense. If you look at the major reformers, the two major reformers, for example, Martin Luther and after him John Calvin, the great French Protestant, neither are for religious freedom. True, they believed that you had to follow your own judgment when reading the Bible, that you maybe be divinely inspired by God, but they went on to argue, especially I remember Luther argues this, that what God wants from us is so plainly spelled out in the Bible that nobody can possibly question it. In other words, it's like me saying, you know, I have my own judgment about what God wants based on the Bible, but you have freedom of conscience. My judgment's so obviously true that only a wicked heretic could possibly disagree with it. So, although you have freedom of conscience, you're clearly not exercising it in the sense of it's not a rational judgment unless you agree with me. Now, because of this, the Protestants, the early Protestants, many of them, tended to be even worse in persecuting heretics than were their Catholic contemporaries. Although Catholics got back in the game with the Counter-Reformation. So you have Protestants not just persecuting Catholics, but persecuting fellow Protestants. And the persecutions of the Anabaptists, means rebaptizer. I mean, if you didn't believe in infant baptism, you were a heretic. Some Protestants used to drown Anabaptists in rivers as a joke about they were rebaptizing them. So that you have persecutions on both sides. What the freedom of conscience argument really comes out of during this period are those lesser known radical sects, so-called, of Protestantism, along with certain Catholics, such as Erasmus would be a good example. So you have both Catholics and Protestants, especially after the horrible disasters and massacres of the so-called wars of religion in post-Reformation Europe. in the 16th and early 17th centuries. These are just horrible wars, so you just have entire towns and thousands of people massacred. And it's been argued by historians that the leaders of these countries that led these wars had political motives, and to a certain extent that's true, but that ferocious, passionate bloodthirst, the blood sport of killing, was largely motivated by hatred of Protestants for Catholics, vice versa. So historians will argue that this idea of freedom of religion came out with sort of a practical remedy, that rulers thought, you know, this idea of having one state religion and enforcing it is costing too much blood and treasure. So as a practical measure, I'm going to have toleration in my own country, even countries with an established church, like the Church of England, the Anglican Church. A lot of Anglicans said, okay, we need a state church, but let's not persecute, you know, the people that don't agree with this. They still have to contribute. They still have to tithe to the established church. But if they want to go to their own churches or whatever, then let them go. Then there was this practical side to the development of the idea of freedom of conscience in the area of religion. But when we get into the 18th century, we see numerous complaints. Thomas Paine was one. There were many others. Richard Price wrote a very good, and I think Joseph Priestley also, two dissenting ministers in England, wrote very good pieces on distinguishing between toleration on the one hand and freedom of conscience on the other. And what they argued is that, and Thomas Paine had put this very well also in Rights of Man, that toleration is not enough. Toleration is in fact state permission. If the state tolerates you, it means that it could choose not to tolerate you. It gives you permission, in effect. It says, okay, we'll tolerate these beliefs out here. But it implies that if it weren't for the good of the state or the good of society, it wouldn't tolerate you. And Paine therefore called toleration a counterfeit freedom. And they pointed out that a government which tolerates things can just as easily not tolerate them. It claims a jurisdiction. Whether it chooses to tolerate or not is a matter at its own discretion. And these 18th century libertarian figures argued that's not the point. The point is it shouldn't even be within the legitimate domain of a government. A government doesn't even have the right to tolerate or not to tolerate. People have freedom of conscience as a matter of inalienable right. So therefore, it falls completely outside the jurisdiction of government, whether to grant it or not. Any government that doesn't recognize freedom of religion borders on being a tyrannical government. Now, what were the arguments used for freedom of religion? Well, here I'm narrowing the term freedom of conscience just to religion. You might think that, well, you know, what does it matter so long as you don't hurt other people what your religious beliefs and practices are? But these people knew full well that religious beliefs can hurt other people. I mean, it can be dangerous in the sense that they can foment attitudes and even things that might lead to murder. I mean, there are a lot of extreme religions. I don't need to tell my audience this. There are a lot of religious teachings that do often lead to crime. So they're faced with this idea, should we forbid certain teachings that might have unfortunate consequences? Should we forbid children from being taught certain doctrines that might lead them to be terrorists and that sort of thing? And they concluded no, that unless somebody actually commits a crime, you can't sort of act in advance by prohibiting that religion. You let people believe what they want, you let them preach what they want. This, of course, was the radical libertarian view. And that depended on a theory of rights. So I want to briefly touch on the libertarian theory of rights. You know, the term rights is so often overused today, but libertarians on the whole were very specific about what they meant. When going back to the ancient Stoics in the period of early Roman and going into late Roman philosophy, a term became very popular, the term the natural equality of mankind. I suppose today we'd say humankind, but the natural equality of mankind. Now what this meant was, in terms of rights, that all people are born morally equal. Nobody has natural authority over anyone else. So that, you know, there are no natural rulers, which of course was later contested by the divine right of kings and so-called patriarchal theory. But the idea was that if you were to claim authority over anyone else, you had to prove that authority. You had to show why other people should obey you. Libertarians pretty much played this idea of natural equality of humankind out consistently, and they said before you can be subject to anyone else in terms of punishing you or telling you what you can and cannot do, you have to consent in some fashion for them to have that authority. So you can give up your natural rights only in some form of consent. Now this didn't really apply to freedom of conscience, because it believed that you can't give up your power of judgment in the first place. In other words, if I said to you, you choose what I should believe, and you'll be responsible for my beliefs. As I pointed out earlier, I think you can't force somebody, you can't dictate to them what they must believe. And since your right of judgment is inalienable from you, and meaning it's a power that you can't transfer to anyone else, therefore you can't transfer the right or power over it. That is why freedom of conscience became the primary inalienable right. And to the extent that a government tried to violate your freedom of belief or freedom of conscience, it was violating a very fundamental inalienable right. Therefore, when you look at the literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, if libertarians were griping about a government, the most serious charge they could make against that government was that that government was violating one's inalienable liberty of conscience, right of conscience. You find all of these people, from John Locke up through James Madison. John Stuart Mill said that the liberty of conscience was the first of all freedoms in the classical liberal tradition. It was the foundation, because the right of private judgment, however you want to say that judgment was arrived at, as long as you're working within in the area of your rights, you had the inalienable right to choose what you wanted to believe and to act on those beliefs, so long, of course, as you didn't violate the rights of other people. Here we have the idea of equal rights. Now I want to conclude by making a note about the meaning of freedom in the classical liberal or libertarian tradition. You will often hear it said, and it's something, by the way, I point out at considerable length, and I should plug my latest book. Again, you probably can't see the title, but it's in the introduction to this talk. The System of Liberty, Themes in the History of Classical Liberalism. Well, one of the themes I discuss extensively in this book is the notion of inalienable rights. I also have an entire section on what I call conscience liberalism. That is that type of libertarian or liberal belief system that was based on the idea of conscience. But I also point out that, as many historians of libertarianism will, that our notion of freedom is basically the absence of coercion. This is called the negative conception of freedom by most philosophers. It's negative because you're free if I just abstain from interfering with your freedom. But there was another side to this, and I'm going to illustrate it by reading a couple of just very brief passages from the famous Cato's Letters, early 18th century. These were letters written, newspaper articles written by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, two early libertarians. Cato's Letters, of course, is what the Cato Institute is named after. And here they point out the positive feature of freedom. And I want to emphasize this here because, as I'll be discussing in a later talk on social psychology, the idea of respecting someone's freedom of conscience meant that you were respecting their humanity. You were respecting their moral autonomy. A lot of people think, well, what's the big deal about just not interfering with people? Well, the big deal is that it's much more tempting to correct somebody who believes differently than you do, to go after and meddle in their lives. To leave someone alone, to respect their own judgment, is to respect their moral autonomy. And this comes out in two brief statements about the meaning of liberty, which will show you that it's not only this negative view, by Trenchard and Gordon. And here's one of them. By liberty, I understand the power which every man has over his own actions, and his right to enjoy the fruit of his labor, art, and industry, as far as by it he hurts not the society nor any members of it, by taking from any member or by hindering him from enjoying what he himself enjoys. The fruits of a man's honest industry are the just rewards of it, ascertained to him by natural and eternal equity, as is his title to use them in the matter which he thinks fit. And thus, with the above limitations, that is, so long as you don't violate others' rights, every man is sole lord and arbiter of his own private actions and property, a character of which no man living can divest him but by usurpation or his own consent. And this is repeated a little later, if I can find this next passage. Here we go. True and impartial liberty is therefore the right of every man to pursue the natural, reasonable, and religious dictates, notice the term religious there, of his own mind, to think what he will and act as he thinks, provided he acts not to the prejudice of another, to spend his own money himself and lay out the produce of his labor his own way, and to labor for his own pleasure and profit, and not for others who are idle, and would live and riot by pillaging and oppressing him, and those that are like him. Now again, you notice the mixing. I mean, they mentioned freedom of conscience in terms of religion, but it's also implied in the freedom to dispose of your property as you see fit. If it's yours, you have a right to use it, to dispose of it, according to your own judgment, according to your own conscience. Okay, I think I'm pretty much out of time here, so I'd like to thank you for listening to this talk, and we'll pick up another theme in the third talk later on. Thank you.